Hi there. So welcome to the first in the sessions of mapping clinics. These are interactive sessions that are helping to answer your questions on anything and everything to do with mapping and GIS. Just before we start, just a little about myself. My name's Jonathan Gatward, and I've been working in the GIS field for over 30 years now, concentrating mainly on environmental applications of mapping and GIS. For the last 10 years, I've been running my own GIS consultancy, working with clients mainly in the UK, but also around the world on a variety of projects, covering all sorts of aspects of GIS, mainly in the areas of ecology, renewable energy, land management, waste management, and land use and contaminated land. With being a consultancy, I get involved in all sorts of different projects and asked all sorts of different questions. So hopefully nothing will be sort of outside my remit, although I may have to go and do a little bit of research on some of the questions to give a fuller answer. The mapping clinics are open to yourselves to put forward questions on anything that you may need help with through this course. And it may be specifically to using the different types of GIS software that are available. And myself, I use QGIS, ArcMap, ArcPro and Google Earth on a daily basis, and swap often between all four of them for any one project. So if there's any technical questions to do with using the software, or maybe how to use one particular function that you're used to in one bit of software and how to use it in another, then can certainly help with that. So just as a basic introduction, I'll just go through some of the main questions and problems that that new users to GIS and mapping frequently come up with. A key aspect of all GIS and all maps is the use of map projections and coordinate reference systems, CRS, as you'll see it referenced in QGIS. This is the main way in which the representation of the globe, the world as a spherical object, is represented in the 2 dimensions that you'd have on a flat map or the computer screen. Map scales, though accuracy and precision is also a key area for investigation and consideration. Depending on what type of work you're doing, you'll be using maps of different scales, and they themselves will be at different levels of accuracy in terms of its geographic location and in the precision and the detail that you can actually get from that map. Whether you're using small scale maps that can be used for mapping whole countries or regions, down to very large scale maps that can identify individual land parcels, fields, houses, and so on. Another common area is how to get your own data into the GIS and other data sources that you may need to find to bring into your GIS to add value to the maps that you're producing. A typical way of getting data into the GIS from your own field surveys is to use spreadsheets or CSV files. And as long as the information that you're having those spreadsheets has some sort of geographic location, whether it be a latitude, longitude, or a grid coordinate point, or a reference to other geographic areas such as countries, counties, administrative areas. Then we can link your own data with other data or map it directly from the latitude longitude coordinates, which are often got from GPS devices or captured through other software such as Google Earth. On the more technical side of things, there's various issues around actually creating your map using the GIS software, in setting up legends, the different GIS layers, and labeling the map. So again, all these are areas of questions that we can deal with. Or in more broader terms, a big area of questions and discussion can be, how would I use GIS to do whatever project or study that you're doing? And it could be talking about the different approaches that you want to use, or the different data sets, or just whether it's possible to do an investigation or study using GIS. So those are some of the broad areas of discussion and questions that we can discuss in the mapping clinics. So we've already had a few questions come through. So following on from the last point of how would I use GIS to do, one of the first questions was, how do I use GIS to map a cave system? Very interesting topic there. The key issue is that cave systems, by their very nature, are underground. And a typical way of producing maps and capturing field survey data is the use of GPS devices. But GPS don't work underground. They rely on having a locational fix from numerous satellites. But it can't get the fix on the satellites if you're underground, or indeed if you're under a significant tree cover, or even in urban areas, if you're surrounded by very tall buildings. It narrows the view of the sky to be able to get the fix of the satellites. And although you be able to get some type of locational reference, it won't be as accurate. So using GPS underground is a problem. And the cave systems themselves are very complex. They're irregular and they're in 3 dimensions. They go into the ground, they go up and down, and often very complex and dangerous places to actually be mapping and working. So you'll see an example of the dangerous nature of that work in the top of the photos, which is actually a flooded cave, and there are cave divers in there exploring the cave, actually swimming underwater. So the solution of trying to map a cave system is using a combination of techniques. So we can use GPS outside in the open to get a good locational fix at the cave entrance. But then once you're inside the cave system, using a number of different other survey techniques to reference back and tie in to that GPS locational fix at the entrance. So we can use laser measures, the good old-fashioned tape measure or rope distance surveying method, or more commonly these days using the LiDAR equipment to give highly detailed, highly accurate survey of the inside features of a cave system. But all of these different survey methods will allow you to survey distances, directions, and heights of the cave system underground. And as long as you can tie them back at the beginning of the survey to a locational fix of the cave entrance, then you can work out the geographic location of all the other measurements within the cave system. So for instance, here's an example of a LiDAR scanner that can be positioned at various points going into the cave system. And again, each survey point with a LiDAR scanner, as long as it's got an overlap with the previous survey that overlaps with your cave entrance, then each of the surveys and the scans that you do with the LiDAR can be geographically correctly located. The results of the LiDAR are very, very detailed and can actually map the cave system in its entirety, looking at incredible detail, but looking at also the three-dimensional nature of that and the internal features. Each of those can then be picked out geographically from the GIS system. And here again is a representation of those cave systems, but on a topographic map showing their routes with the contours, so you can see how they relate to the wider landscape. By being able to bring this into the GIS, then your view of the cave system isn't just limited to the cave you've surveyed, you can see it in its proper geographic context. So we have a few other questions that have come in, which I'll go through. A very interesting question here from Wilbur on how can I develop a predictive GIS and weather-based models for pest risk surveillance? This is a classic use of GIS, particularly in tropical countries where pests actually have a big problem, both for the health of the population in the countries and also the impacts that they can have on crops and vegetation. And GIS is used widely in this area, and a Google search just using some of those basic search terms will reveal a huge amount of numbers of research papers and practical projects that have been done in this area. But to cover this briefly, the key element with all of these types of predictive pest models is being able to think of the different parameters, the different factors that will actually influence the growth and the spread of the pests. And typically these will relate to climate factors such as temperatures, minimum temperatures at night, as well as the ambient temperatures during the day, the humidity, and they're also relating to other factors such as rainfall, crop growth, seasons, and so on. The key aspects with this are looking at the factors that will influence the breeding cycle of the pest, and also what and where they feed on. So, and all these will alter for the specifics of the pest you're concerned with. So the starting point would be to actually identify what pests you're actually concerned with, whether it's the mosquitoes, locusts, whatever particular pest. They'll always have a particular set of factors that influence their breeding patterns, their feeding patterns, and their migration patterns. The key factor then is trying to identify the data sources that would provide you that information for those key factors. So, for instance, if a particular pest is highly influenced by the breeding cycle, looking at its life cycle records of what periods of the year it normally tends to breed and expand and migrate, then you can look at those cyclical patterns and the time-based issues of that. but it might also be looking at the crops that it feeds on or the vegetation that it feeds on. So being able to get habitat and vegetation maps for the area of concern would be a key factor. But as I've mentioned, it might also be relating to temperatures and humidity. So being able to get that climatology data relevant to your area will also be a key factor. And the GIS can help with actually bringing all these different data sources together. And they may vary on a country by country and continent by continent basis. And it may be that the data sets that you have aren't available at a continent-wide areas, such as over the whole of Africa. They may only be available on a country by country basis, or they may be available at an international level over the whole of Africa, but not in enough detail for what you want. So again, being able to identify the level of accuracy and detail that you need out of the data sources will be a key issue. And there's many detailed studies out there that can go into the data sets, the more specific data sets you'd need. But the key thing is being able to identify and be precise what pests you're concerned with, the area that you're of study. Is it looking over the whole of Africa? Is it a particular country within Africa, or just one particular region or locality that you're concerned about? And that will dictate the type of data and the data sources that you need to get. Moving on to a more geoprocessing type of question from John. He asks, what are the main processes that can be applied on vector data? Now, some of you, if you've been working through the course, you'll be aware that there's 4 main types of different data sources, which fall into 2 groups. There's vector and raster data, and I'll just briefly, to be able to answer this question, I'll just briefly run through the different types of data. So vector data is precise coordinate-driven data, and it includes points, such as the locations of a sampling point. It might be the location of a village or a pond, or it might be a measurement location of for doing surveys. But it's defined as just a single coordinate that can then be mapped. There's linear data, or sometimes called polyline data, which is used to represent features such as roads and rivers. And that's just a string of coordinates to form the linear feature. And there's polygon data, which defines enclosed areas, defines polygons such as land parcels, fields, even down to individual buildings can be represented as a polygon. Or at the other end of the scale, it may be an administrative region or even a whole country can be identified as a polygon. The raster data is typically data that's an image. It might be a satellite image, typically those that you use in Google Earth and that are available in QGIS. But it can also represent surface modeling, such as digital terrain models, to represent height and topographic features. And it can also be used to cover broad areas of land that have been classified according to things like vegetation, habitat areas, land use, population distributions. All those can be typically represented using a raster data set. And each of those different data sets can have different processes and analysis done on them within the GIS environment. So for the vector data, the points, lines, and polygons, And there's a number of typical functions that you can use. One that can be used on all of those functions is as a buffering function. You may have it may be a point data set of wells and water supply points. And you may want to identify exclusion zones to protect the quality of that water. So you may want to define an area that's, say, 500 meters around the water supply point, where you'd make sure that there was no polluting activities. So creating a buffer zone of 500 meters around all your water supply points would allow you to identify a safety area, an exclusion zone for maybe excluding or preventing polluting activities, land development, and so on. Or it may be that if in terms of the wildlife side of things, it may be you have particular watering holes, and you know that that a whole variety of different animals will travel up to, I don't know, 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers to drink at that water hole. So you may want to identify the areas where the animals may be coming to drink at that water hole. So again, you can identify a buffer zone of 5 kilometers, say, around all the water holes. And those are areas where you may have different species of animals that will be using that water hole. A similar buffering approach can be used on both linear features and polygons. So you may be wanting to identify, say, a survey zone within 100 meters either side of a track or a road. So buffer zones can be used for that type of thing. Another typical function is what's generally called a point in polygon search. That will allow you to identify, or allow you to combine 2 different vector layers, a point layer and a polygon layer, and be able to identify which of those points lie within a particular polygon or a particular set of polygons. So it may be that you have had a number of wildlife observation points, and you want to identify where those, if any of those observation points lie close to watering holes. So again, using a combination of data sets and buffers, you may buffer around the water holes, say 200 meters. There you've got then a polygon data set of a 200 meter buffer around your water holes, and then you can then search for all the observation points, your wildlife sampling or observation points that lie within those zones. And that's called a point in polygon search. But you may want to also be looking at, it may be wanting to overlay different layers of polygon data. So you may have a set of polygons that define the territories of some of the predator species, and you may also have a polygon data set of the territories or the home ranges of species such as antelope or other animals like that. And being able to then overlay both sets of data, the territories of your predators and your home ranges of other species, you can look at the overlap between the two. And there's lots of different overlap types of functions that allow you to combine different polygon layers. So again, there's many different functions on that. I'll just share my screen for QGIS to give you a few examples of where those functions can be found within the QGIS GIS environment. So if you bear with me just while I share my QGIS screen. So here's QGIS with the some of the different data sets that are provided through the mapping course, the Activity 3 data sets. And there's various functions that are available for vector and raster data. And if we look at the functions available under the vector pull down menu, you see there's quite a lot of functions under the geoprocessing tools. There's the buffer function that I've mentioned. And these functions here, difference, dissolve, intersection, symmetrical difference, union, eliminate selected polygons. Those are all different functions that can be used in on vector data sets for overlapping different polygons. There's other geometry tools that can be used on the vector data. So if you've got a set of polygons, and the data sets we have here look at showing the provinces and the district municipalities, you can calculate the centroids, the coordinates of the center point of those polygons. We can convert polygons to lines. We can simplify the outlines of polygons. And there's various function here called Voronoi polygons, or Thessian polygons as they're sometimes known, basically generating area-based data from point samples. So there's a lot of different functions that are available there for vector data. And also within the QGIS environment, if we look at the toolbox that's available from the processing menu, it brings up a whole load of more tools, and you see all the functions here. There's a whole group of functions that are all about vector processing. And if we open up different ones of these, there's again a whole host of different functions relating to vector data. So QGIS is a wonderful tool because it provides you with so many of these ready-made functions for use on your data sets. Which functions you use will be dependent on exactly what you're trying to achieve, the type of analysis or the type of processing that you want to perform on your vector data. But depending on what you want to do, the vast majority of your functions that you'd want to be using it will already be available within the QGIS environment. There's a question from Dari or Dare on the use of GPS. So his question is, in the use of GPS for collecting spatial data of tree species, what are the alternative ways of getting the correct tree location when there is a canopy cover that disrupt GPS readings? So this partly overlaps with my first question I was dealing with on mapping cave systems, in that the GPS relies on being able to get a locational fix from multiple satellites. The more satellites that it can have a view of in the sky, the more accurate the locational fix. And also, the longer you leave your GPS device stationary, it gives it more time to be able to collect those locational fixes from the satellite. In any area where the view of the sky is limited, such as in under a tree canopy, or even in an urban area, as I think I've mentioned before, then the view of the sky, the view the GPS device has of the satellites will be limited, and therefore the accuracy of the location that it can give is being compromised. So again, in a similar way for the cave mapping the cave system, there's a number of ways that you can get a correct tree location. One is to be able to, if you've correctly mapped and surveyed the edges of a dense woodland, then taking distance measures from the edge of the woodland into the woodland will be able to give you a fix of whereabouts in the woodland, under the woodland canopy you are. You could use laser and LiDAR techniques as well to map underneath the canopy cover. But other techniques, if it's dense tree canopy, then you may not be able to get as accurate fix as you need for your survey. So other survey techniques, such as using satellite imagery or drones, would be really useful in this context. Using drones or unmanned autonomous vehicles, UAVs as they're generically known, and being able to fly over the tree canopy would give you a very, very good, accurate set of imagery from which tree measurements and even being able to identify tree species could be captured. So as is so often the case in GIS and geospatial data sets, it's often you have to work with what you've got and in situations that you're wanting to do the survey or study. And it's often about being aware of the range of different data sets you can use. So if one data set is not suitable, or it's not practical to collect that in the field, look for other data sets that may be able to use to be able to give you the information you need. A question here from Holly on the difference between GIS commands and GIS tools. She asked, I hear of GIS commands and GIS tools. Do you use tools to make the commands? And yes, within the GIS environment, as you've seen from the previous screen I showed of QGIS, there are a lot of predefined tools already available within whatever GIS environment you're using. And I'd say for 80% of the work that you'd need, or sometimes 100% of the work that you'd need within the GIS, there'll be a ready-made tool for you to do exactly what you want to do. Accessible from a pull-down menu or dialog box. And certainly with QGIS, there's a large number of plugins that other people have developed that can be added to the QGIS environment to expand the range of functions and tools that are available. In the early days of GIS, many of these functions were only available from a command line, and you'd have to remember and know how the command was structured and have to write that in as a command line function to be able to do even some of the most basic functions of a GIS. Things have moved on a long way, and most of those functions that would have been done through a command line have now been programmed and packaged up into a much more user-friendly environment. There's still scope for developing your own specific tools, and as you get more used to using GIS or use it in more specific ways, there'll probably be specific functions that you need to use time and time again that aren't quite there in as ready-made tools, or that you may need to string together several tools to be able to give the functions that you need. And this is where the command line option, often using programming tools such as Python, actually allow you to program those tools from specific commands to be able to then use them as just a drop-down menu or specific tool that you can use for doing your specific functions or share with others that want to do the same set. So yes, most of the functions of a GIS are done through their ready-made tools, but those tools will have been made and created at some point using specific commands. Holly has also asked about thematic raster sets What is a thematic raster set? When would I use it? How do I create it? And why would I do that? As I've already mentioned, the raster data is typically used for satellite imagery and is often used to represent data that is continuous, as a continuous variable, such as height or temperature or population distributions. It will vary over an area, whether that area is a town, a region, or a whole country. And typically, the raw data is collected with a variety of values and continuously variable values within the data set that gives a lot of detail, but is actually hard to interpret and process and show within the GIS environment. So being able to classify this data into in a thematic way makes it much easier to understand what's going on within the data set, much easier to process and much easier to be able to map. So for instance, a vegetation or habitat raster data set will have been processed from typically multi-band satellite imagery that collects data on a number of different wavebands, the red, green and blue visible waveland, and typically different infrared wavebands that pick up various aspects of vegetation. This can be processed and classified to create a thematic raster data set that identifies a more limited number of specific vegetation or habitat types, such as woodland, water, grassland, urban development, that type of thing. And that would be a thematic raster data set. In the same way that using surface modeling data from a digital terrain model, you can calculate a slope aspect, as well as the height. You can calculate the slope angle and the direction of slope. And those slope angles will be continuously variable through from 0 in the north all the way down to 180 degrees in the south, through to back up to 360 degrees in the north for the slope aspect, the direction the slope's facing. But you may want to just simplify that and classify it into north, northeast, east, and so on facing slopes. And that would be a thematic map once you've classified those that data into those more limited thematic classes. So yeah, a thematic raster data set is basically a classified raster set of data, and its use is for making it easier to display, interpret, and analyze. And all those classification functions are also available in the QGIS project. Wilbur's come up with a question asking, kindly provide an overlook of GIS technology in plant breeding area. And again, it's a similar response to what I do to looking at the pest risk surveillance, in that the key with the GIS technology is being able to get the relevant data sets. So GIS is always run from the data. So the first question, rather than concentrating on looking at what GIS technology can be used in the plant breeding area, the first question would really be what information, what data is available for the plant breeding area, and that will of course be specific to the types of plants you want to breed and the area that you're dealing with in. But again, would typically relate to certainly climate conditions, temperature ranges, daytime and minimum temperatures at night, rainfall and moisture content within the soil, soil information, which will also be related to geology types, And again, going back to slope angles, some plants and crops would require slopes to give the drainage, or flat areas to be able to cultivate them. So again, depending on what plants you're interested in and the areas that you're looking at and the scale that you're looking at, are you just looking at a national scale, or are you looking at what can be what types of plants can be grown in a particular land parcel of a specific farm? So all of those questions you need to be thinking about to be able to identify the different to be able to identify the different data sets. Once you've got the data, then the GIS technology can be used to pull those data sets together, to integrate the different data sets, and to be able to process and map those. Again, it may be that you're overlaying different data sets to look at a combination of factors, and GIS is great for overlaying multiple data sets. But you might be interested in there's no point growing crops if you can't get them to where people need them. So part of that, maybe you may be interested in transport routes and distances to market, or travel time to market. If it's perishable food, you may actually want to be able to get it to the marketplace within a few hours of it being cropped. So travel time, travel distance, transportation may also be a key aspect. So have a think about the specifics of what it is you're wanting to identify, and the data sets that you need for that. And then there'll be various aspects of GIS technology that will be appropriate for analysing and mapping those data sets. A final question here from Holly about the differences of map projections, particularly in the term of using a map projection of WGS 84, which is a common map projection used worldwide in QGIS. And you'll see a lot of QGIS projects, or a lot of data sets used within the QGIS project, will be set up to use WGS 84 CRS system, coordinate reference system, or mapping projection system. And this is essentially, it's a global map projection system that uses latitude and longitude for its coordinate references. So if you're in the field with a GPS device and that's capturing latitude and longitude coordinates, then you'll typically import those into QGIS, or use them within QGIS, using the WGS 84 CRS system. And your GPS device, that WGS 84 may be an option for setting your GPS device as well. It's not just relating to QGIS or the GIS environment, it's used for any surveying system anywhere in the world, and is a global way of referencing data. And that means that it's also a really good CRS mapping projection to use for integrating data from lots of different sources that maybe have been collected at different places around the world. So it's a common standard. The difficulty with using WGS 84, though, is that it's trying to represent the world, a spherical object, and often what you're needing to do is map that and process and analyze the spherical coordinates around the globe in 2 dimensions on a flat map or a flat computer screen. And again, the whole topic of map projections is a massive topic, and I'd certainly recommend reading up about this. But for being able to do more accurate small area studies and analysis, particularly where you're calculating areas or measuring distances, then a more localized map projection or CRS system specific to the area in the world you're looking at is highly recommended. So using the universal transverse Mercator map projection is a common way of being able to do more localized mapping, and this you'll see in the GIS as referenced as UTM zones. And I'll just share my screen once more and show you in QGIS where the map projection systems are. So under Project, Properties, and the CRS tab, this gives lists of all sorts of map projection systems. And if we just type into the search term UTM, you can see it gives a list of different UTM zones for use around the world. And the little map on the bottom right hand side below this shows you the area of coverage. And you can see that depending which UTM zone you're using, it will show whereabouts on this spherical globe that will be appropriate for. So wherever you're mapping, there'll be an appropriate UTM zone for whatever part of the world that you're using. And using the UTM zone will give you more accurate and usable distance and area measurements. So I think that comes to the end of the sets of questions. There will be another mapping clinic on Friday, the 8th of April, and we'll be covering more questions then. So feel free to post your questions, and I'll be able to do the best to answer them. There's a few questions already in that I'll be covering on some of the more wider ranges of GIS functionality, covering data acquisition, processing, analysis, storage, and output. And we'll probably be covering issues on map accuracy, such as Google Earth, on that day as well. So thank you very much for attending this mapping clinic, and look forward to seeing you again on Friday. Thank you.